Okay, so thanks to the organizers of the conference. This is a great conference. It's becoming a very important annual tradition, and I look forward to many more until we achieve social justice in the area of mining and beyond. And so obviously this is a short talk, so it's going to be of necessity somewhat superficial, so I'll apologize in advance, and people hopefully will have questions to fill in some of the gaps from the talk. But my starting point is fairly basic and perhaps not surprising given the title of my book, but the starting point I think for any discussion of Canadian mining is that Canada is an imperialist country. And I want to stress that point, that there is a broader context in which Canadian mining is situated, in which we need to understand and situate Canadian mining around the world, and obviously most particularly in the global south. And so just quickly, what I mean by imperialism, in just a very rough definition, is the relationship between the global south is a systematic relationship whereby the wealth and the resources and the labor of the north are exploited and systematically drawn from the south to the global north to the benefit, not of us, but of corporations or Canadian capital. And obviously that's a relationship that's broader than just Canada, but often Canada doesn't get the attention that it should, except perhaps in conferences like this where we're talking about mining. So it's a systematic relationship. It's not one particular company or one particular government policy or a particular government that's, say, the government of Stephen Harper. This extends well beyond Stephen Harper. It existed long before Stephen Harper. And until folks like us actually change the world, it's going to exist after Stephen Harper. I would even go so far to suggest that it would exist under Thomas Mulcair should he win the leadership in the next election. And so just very quickly, Canada, and I don't have time to give stats on this, but Canada is, whether we're looking in absolute terms or relative terms, that is relative comparing Canada, controlling for the size of Canada's economy compared to other rich countries of the global north, Canada is one of the largest foreign investors in the global south, period. Okay? So in absolute terms, Canada is usually in the top 10 or so of investor nations in the global south. In relative terms, it's even higher. That is when you control for the size of its economy. Much of that's concentrated in Latin America, but it's global. From Africa to the Asia Pacific to Central Asia, and so on. And obviously, there's been a real shift from the post-war period where about 10% of Canadian foreign investment went to the third world of the global south, to the current period where over 27% of Canadian foreign investment goes to the third world. So it's an increasingly important place for Canadian capital, Canadian multinational corporations to do business and to earn profits. And they certainly do earn a lot of profits from their investments. And so in 2007, just before the financial crash, Canadian companies earned $24 billion from their investments in the third world. That was an over 500% increase from the earnings that they made from their investments in the third world in 1980. So you see a significant shift in the orientation of Canadian capital to the global south. I gave the number for 2007 because that's the year before the financial crash, and so those numbers went down slightly from, as one would expect, as they did for all countries and global north countries relative to the global south. They went down, and it's starting to creep up in the last year or so. So as the economy picks up steam, as commodity prices increase and so on, you've seen a resurgence of Canadian profits from the global south. And this investment, just before we get back to the mining issue, it's not just in mining. Obviously, people know that Canada is the largest mining nation in the world, but Canada also has significant investments, particularly in banking, in hydroelectric dam projects, in maquilas or sweatshop manufacturing. The largest single t-shirt sweatshop manufacturer in the world is a Canadian company, Gildan Activewear. Life insurance and so on. So there's a whole number of companies or industries in which Canadian capital is engaged in the third world, in the global south, exploiting the cheap labor of workers in the global south, gaining access to the natural resources of the global south. But obviously mining is very, very important. And that's why we're here. Canada, as I said, is the largest mining industry in the world. In 2009, the last year for which I could find data, which is collected through the Natural Resources Canada Ministry, Canadian companies had over $109 billion invested in over 90 different countries. Okay. So first, that's a lot of money, and second, it's spread globally. Okay. In 21 countries, the assets of Canadian mining companies exceeded $1 billion. So it's a lot of money, and it's spread globally, but then there's also countries where it's heavily concentrated. Okay. Latin America accounts for 51.5% of all that investment, so 56 billion. And then there's a few countries in Latin America where it's concentrated quite a bit, so Mexico, Chile, and maybe Jamie can, Peru. And then there's a whole bunch, and Ecuador, sort of, and probably more so in the future. And then there's a whole bunch of other countries where, Argentina, where investment is not insignificant and growing. Dominican Republic would be another one. And so mining investment has situated Canadian multinational corporations, as some of the most powerful actors in a number of different countries. So I just listed a few. Canada is the second largest foreign investor in Honduras. It's the second largest foreign investor in the Dominican Republic. Sometimes it's the first in the Dominican Republic. That's largely in the Dominican Republic because of Barrick Gold and Goldcorp. Second largest last time I looked in Guatemala. In Mexico, it's the fourth largest investor from 2000 to 2010. And the largest single investor 2 years ago, I haven't seen for the most recent year, was Goldcorp. 2010 and in 2011, for the last 2 years, Canada is the largest foreign investor in Nicaragua. Cumulatively, Canada is the third largest foreign investor in Chile, the number one, biggest foreign investor in Chile in 2010. And Canada is one of the largest foreign investors in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mali, Senegal, Tanzania, I believe as well, and more. Just to give you a quick sort of picture of it. And what's important to note too, when we're talking about mining, as I sort of indicated, it's not just mining, but a lot of the other investment is connected to mining. So when Canadian companies are investing in mining, there's opportunities for other industries to grow. And so just to give you a couple quick examples, one would be, the most obvious would be banking. So in the Western Hemisphere, two of the biggest banks operating outside of their own borders are Scotia and Royal. And that's an investment relationship that actually goes back a century. Those two companies following around American-backed dictatorships. But now they also play a significant role for natural resources development. And one good example of that would be a year ago, or actually less than a year ago, Scotiabank's $1 billion takeover of the fifth largest bank in Colombia, Banco Colpatria. And in interviews, the head of Scotiabank in the Colombian press was actually quite clear about the main motivation for this takeover. It was because of the free trade agreement that had been signed with both Canada, the United States, and Colombia, and the massive growth that's been going on and which will continue in the natural resources sector, in particular mining. And people probably, hopefully saw a Colombian activist speak yesterday. It was fantastic, talking about just the significant presence of Canadian mining companies. So banking would be one example. And in the English Caribbean, because a lot of the banking money goes through offshore financial centers, so like kind of tax haven places. And then it goes from there into various countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The Canadian banks, which is largely the two banks I just mentioned, plus the CIBC, control the three largest banks in the English-speaking Caribbean with $42 billion in assets. No close competitor to those banks. Another good example of just the sort of a tie-in with other companies or other industries with respect to mining would be hydroelectric development. And I will just point people to a recent report, very good, written by Alex Latta and Carrie Williams from Laurier, University of Laurier's Global Studies program on Chile. And they talk about the significant growth of, which I just alluded to, of Canadian mining companies in Chile. But the connection between those mining companies and the growth of Canadian hydroelectric development projects, which are extremely questionable, environmentally speaking, ecologically speaking, in Chile and are contested, and there's a lot of opposition to mining and the hydroelectric development projects. But the reason why there's a big growth in hydroelectric development in Chile right now is because of the significant growth of mining. And they give some really interesting stats about how much mining comprises the growth of hydroelectric development projects in Chile. Now, of course, we could spend the whole weekend and many, many more weekends besides talking about the human rights and ecological conflicts that Canadian mining companies are systematically involved in. And I'm not going to go into that here because probably many of you are familiar with some of these stories, or you've been to panels this weekend that talk about that. So I won't detain us on that, but just to remind us that these things are not isolated incidents. You know, it's not an accident. There's been 8 people assassinated in Mexico and Central America in the last 2 years who are opposing Canadian mining projects. Someone who was killed in Peru last summer opposing Canadian mining projects, and we're going to talk about